Hello. So today we'll be working on section C of paper 2, and in section C we'll be dealing with the topic. Just give me a minute. Alright, so we'll be dealing with the topic challenges of social transformation, crisis of development, displacement, environmental problem, and sustainability. Now let's have a look at some of the PYQs. In 2014, there was a question on rural landless laborers and development-induced displacement. The same question was repeated, sort of like the words were rearranged a bit in 2015. Then in 2017, there's a direct question on how development-induced imbalances need urgent attention. In 2018, there was a question on tribal uprising and displacement. In 2019, it was a question on sort of a policy analysis, rural development programs in India. So this sort of also relates to the GS papers, like you get your static base from the other GS papers and then you just need to analyze it sociologically. So in this case, the only thing that will differentiate it from a GS answer is that here you will bring in sociological perspectives. When talking about rural development programs and analyzing them, you have to introduce a sociological optic. For example, feminist perspective. That how even after the introduction of the Land Reforms Act, there has been no change in the position of women, and in fact even government policies sort of reinforce women's lack of access to ownership of land or property. And you can bring in the subaltern perspective, the new liberal perspective, and this is how I think we should approach this question. Then 2019 question is about urban displacement dynamics in India, sort of again quite similar to what we have seen between 2014 to 2017. 2019, the environment perspective got introduced into the questions, and we see how reduction of green cover affects ecological degradation and global warming. Then in 2020, there has been a question on anthropogenic influence on climate in India and the environmental movements arising out of it in 2021. Again, it seems like a favorite question. Displacement is inherent in the idea of development. In 2022, development and environment. So it seems like that over the years, UPSC is sort of shifting towards climate and development, this synergy and this interconnection in questions. But at the same time, it seems that displacement and development is like a pet favorite. It's repeated every other year. So that's about the PYQs, and let's move on to. Alright, so under the topic crisis of development, displacement, environmental problems, and sustainability, let's try to break down the topic. We have the keywords in front of us: displacement, the crisis of development, the crisis of development, displacement, environmental problems, and sustainability. Now, as I was looking at these keywords, like the topic itself has certain keywords, these keywords again can be understood in terms of the different aspects of associated with them. So we'll take each keyword, and when making notes or when trying to understand the basics of a topic, we look at the definitions, the dimensions, like whenever we are talking about development and environment and sustainability. So the basics would include concepts like smart city, urban floods, COVID migration, or deforestation, and such issues which are associated with development, the crisis induced by development, and also the environmental problems of sustainability. Some examples, some data. that we keep reading in newspapers, and also the perspectives to understand these keywords, which can be Marxist or feminist and subaltern. Now, if you're following these lectures, you would know that we are basically just delving into the core basics of a certain topic. We do not delve too much into the details or whatever the current events are. That is something that you have to build up on your own. But here is an important link. So as you can see, I think there is a network issue. Please give me a moment. Hi, so I've been facing some network issues. Anyway, there is this brilliant blog on sociology, brainstormingsociology.wordpress.com. So whatever it is, the basics that we are discussing here, you can always supplement it with some of very interesting and informative articles on this blog page. So yeah, if you open the web page, here it is. You can see a sociological analysis of some important current events happening around us: the Manipur ethnic conflict, the UCC debate, village studies, reproductive health of women, which has also been a previous year question. So it will give you an idea of how we need to interconnect the static and the dynamic linkages. Anyway, let's move on with the topic. We first move on to development and displacement. Let's look at some of the definitions. So first of all, Yogendra Singh describes development as the strategy of planned social change that is considered desirable by the society. Gunnar Myrdal has added another dimension to this aspect of development, and according to them, rationality is a precondition for development. If that is absent, it leads to crisis of development in the modern world, which is a paradoxical situation and has negative effects. Now, what are the consequences of development? So there is a thinker, Matthew Ariparampal, and he has talked about how development often leads to land alienation, industrialization, and then urbanization. And these three together lead to multiple forms of dispossession, especially for the vulnerable sections of the society. So, for example, mining happens in the Chota Nagpur plateau, and it evicts the indigenous people out of their ownership over the land and the means of production associated with that land. And this displacement leading to dispossession, it happens in 3 stages. First, you are alienated from your land. Then industrialization happens on that land. Finally, we move on to urbanization, while the vulnerable sections are left out from the planning process. So, in some ways, like, you can already get an idea of how development is a very skewed business. It benefits a section while dispossessing the other section. So in functional terms, or in traditional terms, you can it can be said that displacement is a necessary evil for the greater good of development. From a subaltern view, and an important thinker here is Fernandez, and he says that tribals are the most affected. What actually is displacement? So displacement can be described as a relocation of large number of people to another territory that is usually forced and permanent. Some of the examples to understand it could be mining in the Chota Nagpur plateau, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, Silent Valley Hydroelectric Project. So I'm just giving you some examples. You might have to read up on them like a little bit in detail and form your own perspectives and do your own research. So far, like, whatever we have seen, the subaltern view and the traditional view of how displacement is a necessary evil for greater good of development, it remains to be seen which thing outweighs the other. Does the good outweigh the evil, or does the evil outweigh the good? And here is a very important perspective by S. Parashuraman, and he says that development, the way we understand development, has some structural biases. It favors the minority elites. And who are these minority elites? These minority elites include a group of industrialists, or those in political classes, or those in those who are members of dominant classes. And these minority elites, the interest of these minority elites, override the rights of the millions of the people who have to pay the price without reaping any benefits. So this structural bias that is inherent in development, ultimately the evil trumps over the good. And you can sort of like contrast these two perspectives. There is like the functional perspective, which sees it as a greater good, which sees it as like a necessary evil for a greater good, but then Parashuraman offers some sort of a conflict perspective. This structural bias has a class perspective to it, and you can relate it to the conflict perspective. Then in the context of things like special economic zones and smart cities, neoliberalism and globalization come to the fore. And here you have these very interesting thinkers, Pramanik and Ganguly. They talk about how globalization, or the interest of the new elites, the neoliberal elites in globalization, leads to the disposing of and displacement of communities that are considered as impediments to market integration. So often development becomes this top-down approach. Like we see it in terms of we see it in terms of revamping, let's say, public spaces in a certain way. Even if revamping of the public spaces leads to the throwing out of people who are dependent, dependent for shelter, or for economy, or for their livelihood on those very public spaces. So for example, I think a very interesting example could be here Mumbai and the rise of slums. Often, you might have read it somewhere, how the unorganized sector, or even a lot of organized sectors, depend a lot on the labor and the skill that comes from slums. And often in the name of development, or whenever something like a revamping of public spaces happens, or whenever this context of development comes into the picture, it is the slum dwellers, it is the squatters who are sort of like bulldozed over, who are sort of sidelined, and their opinions not even taken into account, while their livelihood, economy, and just their basic right of access to shelter is very cruelly trampled upon. Just like an example to understand this point. Then another important perspective could be feminist perspective, and we have two important thinkers here, Mridula Ganguly and Inakshi Thukral. So Mridula Ganguly talks about how even in cases of development-induced displacement, the rehabilitation policies always ignore women's rights. So if you followed the previous lectures, there was this point that we discussed, how women are closer to nature, and they're more dependent on nature for survival, for livelihood, and even for sustenance. Often development means controlling nature or curtailing nature for its own benefit. So when this nature is controlled and it leads to dispossession of the indigenous people, it's the women who are left with nothing. And the rehab policies do not take this into account. In fact, I think if you read more into the Narmada Bachao Andolan, you would notice that it's basically the women who are very active in the society organizations associated with the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and it's these women who are very vociferously arguing for their rights. Then Inakshi Thukral makes this point of how the Land Acquisition Act brought in by the government, it just reinforces women's lack of property ownership. The next subtopic is environment and sustainability. So, like after the 1987, the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, climate change or climate resilience or knowledge about climate in general is and has become a part of general lexicon. And here is a very interesting caveat. Urban development does not always translate to sustainability. In fact, it often runs counter to the logic of sustainability. It poses a big challenge to environment and sustainability. So, when talking about sustainability, you can either use the UN definition that you might have read it in your NCERT textbooks, that sustainability is the management of resources in a way such that you preserve them for the upcoming generations and use them in very judicious ways. And then there is another very interesting definition given by Dean Dhanagre. He refers to sustainability as growth with justice. A very powerful definition, I would say. And when linking environment and sustainability and development, some of the examples that you can look into are fragile Himalayan ecosystem. So like the recent cases of Joshimath landslide, the MC Mishra report, or pollution like stubble burning and winters in Delhi. You can maybe even bring in the methyl isocyanate case, the Bhopal gas leak tragedy. And as you might all be witnessing right now, the issue of urban floods. So this is something that that I came across like a few days ago in the newspaper, a very interesting article. Delhi urban floods, displacement and development. So this is what the article talks about. In 2004, Delhi High Court had ordered eviction of unauthorized settlements on the floodplains. This led to the demolition of all these temporary structures and shanties, which led to the eviction of around more than 2 lakh people. So you're seeing how the idea of development led to displacement. And this subsequent eviction on the charge of pollution. So development is supposedly targeting pollution, okay? Like it has a certain logic to it. But see what it leads to. And it ultimately cleared the way for the construction of capital-intensive projects of urban infrastructure and elite consumption. Sociologist Amitabh Aviskar wrote in a paper. So see, the thing is, like I included this here just to give you an idea of how to utilize your newspaper reading. This is like just a very small paragraph in a whole article. But once you know what the syllabus of sociology is, and when you're reading even current things, this is how you link them, the static and the dynamic. And I mean, this particular para, it very beautifully connects everything that we've been talking about: development, displacement, environment. So the logic for displacement is that, okay, environment is being harmed and we have to focus on development. But what sort of development? Who is this development catering to? Elite consumption. And remember, like everywhere you read about elite consumption or something, you can always invoke Marxist philosophy here. It can be like a very important segue into the notions of conspicuous consumption and neoliberal debates on consumption and how that is harming environment and also leading to a very skewed, enforced, top-down idea of development. So let's look at some of the perspectives. You can look at global and neoliberal perspectives. You can maybe quote Wallerstein here, that all these things that we're talking about, Earth Summit, Paris Conference, UNFCCC, somehow even when they are talking about climate resilience or climate resilient infrastructure, um, or even about historical emissions of developed nations, somehow these are still dominated by this global north versus global south debate. I mean, global south takes a different stance, global north takes a different stance, and this power dynamic can be seen at play here. Then we can talk about policy of state intervention, the environment impact assessment, and NGTs. You can talk about civil society interventions, for example, Save the RA movement in Mumbai. Then a very interesting feminist perspective is offered by Vandana Shiva and Beena Agarwal. So like whenever there is something related to feminism and environment, you can always go to Vandana Shiva. She is the thinker when it comes to environment and feminism. Now, in this perspective, it is believed that gender equality is the way to achieve sustainable development. Why? Because women are closer to nature, and you empower women, you empower nature and a more sustainable way of living. You can maybe put in some examples also here. So for like in India, there are a lot of festivals that are associated with women. I do not remember exactly. You might have to read a bit into it, like what festivals are popular in the different regions. So yeah, there is Tej, and in Rajasthan, I think there is a festival of Gora. What happens in these festivals is they're associated with like women, and they usually worship the trees. And there is Tulsi Viva also. Yeah, they worship trees and plants, and it reinforces this connect between women and nature, wherein you acknowledge that how your sustenance is dependent on your natural environment. Then Beena Agarwal's, you can quote this, she gives this term, what we need is now a feminist environmentalism to move towards a more sustainable society. Postmodern perspective would be that all this debate of ecological modernization has led to an overemphasis on technical breakthroughs, on technological breakthroughs, that we need to invent new technologies. For example, to deal with pollution, you might have heard of technologies like scrubbers or catalytic converters or something along those lines. But this technological breakthroughs often lead to a technological anarchism. You cannot deal with the crisis of development and with environmental problems with technology alone. You need a more holistic perspective. So ecological modernization is sort of a bit flawed. Then the neoliberal discourse would include how this would like talk about how this discourse of development, how we understand development, sort of favors minority elites. And examples would be the notion of smart cities. It leads to removal of slums and squatters. And which section of the people is are the ones who are the worst affected? These are your lower caste and lower class people who do not have any other agency or any other bargaining power. So what ahead could be what should be the way ahead? What could be done? Again, your example is sustainable, your answer should be sustainable development, the institutional mechanisms, which would include your NGT and the EIA. You can always give an example. Then there is a very interesting perspective by Ulrich Beck, and he talks about risk society, how increasingly we are living in this global interconnected world, wherein it's not like any environmental problem or any development induced problem is a regional or a local problem only. It's a global issue, because any development induced crisis can lead to international migrations. It also endangers the very sensitive socio-political framework in a certain region. So it has global repercussions now, and that is why we need to move away from the traditional notions of nation state or from traditional notions of nation state or different agencies of government. No, we need a very cosmopolitan approach. We need an alliance between governments and civil society, between different nations, global alliances, and the way ahead is a cosmopolitan state, because environment is an issue that requires, or like development is an issue that requires multiple stakeholders, and all the voices need to be taken into account, because we cannot even foresee the risk anymore. And an example of this could be like COVID. Nobody could have foreseen COVID, but the issues or like the repercussions, the negative repercussions that it had on development, like economic growth came to a standstill, or the sort of displacement that it led to, or like the result on environment, all these three things are interconnected, and to deal with them we now need to move on to this greater synergy between citizens, states, civil society organizations, and international organizations in general. So this covers the topic for today, and I hope you find it useful.